The father of history, Herodotus. The father of scientific history, Thucydides.
They don't mention Rome. Not one of them mentions Rome. What? Are you kidding me? The crucified savior already existed in Italy and Greece long before the Christian era. I've never come across one artifact or ancient document. There's nothing in the historical record that says he was cut up into 14 pieces. What's crazy to me that people aren't talking about is the Etruscans have way more affinity with the Egyptians than they do with the Greeks. Way more. All roads literally lead to Rome.
Welcome to the One Within All, to a very different and special episode of Interverse. Different in just the sense that with the work we're going to be discussing, Dylan's brand new book, The Real Universal Empire, getting into the details and the deep research that this book contains. I read all of it. It's excellent. I think it might be the best book that he's written so far. It also stands alone. So if you haven't caught up on the Spirit World books, but you're curious about making sense of the farrago of history and myth, this book is really going to put your perspective in order by eliminating a bunch of nonsense and just bringing common sense to the equation of where did this universal empire, system of priestcraft, system of society really originate? What are the oldest origins of written language and letters? How did it get spread around? What actual boots on the ground physical evidence can we point to, architectural or artifact, that demonstrates this thread of the historical chain of events and can help us see through the fog and the haze of mosaic history that's been foisted upon Western culture for millennia at this point, and is completely disproven by many authors before Dylan, but particularly well done in the refutations in his Spirit World series. And on that note, we also just wrapped up and submitted the 6th Spirit World book to Audible. So in a couple of weeks, probably, or less, you'll be able to get my silky, sultry audiobook narration voice for Terminalia, which is an excellent read as well. So we're going to be discussing...
So proud of what we've been able to do. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, I'm so proud of that. That book is so good. I cannot wait.
Man, I don't even have notes in front of me. You hear this? I'm reading. It's as if I'm reading an introduction. That's how stoked I am about this content. I'm feeling, the wine of poetry coursing through my veins or whatever. So we're going to be going through what I felt like were great points to talk about from the book, having just recently read it. We got a nice outline. We're well prepared. We're handsome. This is going to be fun. So, Dylan,
yeah, looking sharp.
Welcome, man, and thanks for being here as usual. Really excited that we're doing this in a more prepared way. The information, the gravy is just golden and piping hot.
Well, thanks for having me. And the goal for this book is to make it accessible to as many people. Like, I think you could have given me this book when I was 10 years old. I was a voracious reader as a child. I stopped reading once I got into my teens because there wasn't really books that were like being given to me that were fun to read. And my goal is to at least contribute this to something that teachers and stuff could give to their children, or homeschool people could give and say, hey, you're going to learn a lot of things in your history classes, but I want you to be prepared for this so you can arm yourself when people say nonsense. You can I don't want to say contradict or like combat. It's not really something to be like combative about. It's just something to say, hey, if that's what you're claiming, that, for example, that this culture descended from Greece, why is their language nothing like Greek if they got their letters from Greeks? There's just a lot of things you can do. And one of the cool things that got me going with this is seeing years ago when I was going through Godfrey Higgins material. Do you remember he published?
I'm still going through it.
Oh yeah,
for years.
I mean, you're gonna be, yeah. That's a big commitment. Even if you read that every day, you'd probably take you a couple of years to get through his work, at least a year. But
if you're really comprehending it, processing it, and taking notes on it, you might get through, a page front and back in 30 or 40 minutes.
And that's what I do. Like we do that. When we see something we don't reckon, I know you're the same way. When we see something we've never heard before, we look it up and we see what we're able to follow. And if we can find something, great. We've now just confirmed it. If we can't, it's like you said the other day, you looked up something and you're like, I don't know. I don't have any receipts on this. It's because it's probably wrong. If we're being honest, it might not be, but generally speaking, when there's no receipts, it's because it was an error. But he posted something.
One thing I learned from your book today that I looked up, a word that I didn't know, is a thalassocracy or a thalassocrat.
Yeah. Lords of the Sea.
Right, exactly. That's an empire or a nation who makes its way on the seas, a sea-bound empire. So the thalassocratic states, they don't usually progress very far inland. They populate and colonize along the coastal areas of all the places that they can get into range of. And that's what this real universal empire, that's what we're really looking at, is a thalassocratic empire. And then, so I had to look up that word today from reading your book. And also for people that really want to get their teeth into stuff or wrap their arms around stuff, what we were just mentioning is worth it to think about. And you never know. You might just consider yourself someone who's curious and wants to know stuff, but you may someday realize that you have all this knowledge in your head, but you don't have the linkages to access it unless just sort of the right conversation comes up and it pops into your mind and you're like, oh yeah, I did know that. So whenever you're going through material like Dylan's or sources that maybe he references or your own personal research, it could be on any topic. If you get into the habit of having a physical notebook or a notepad open on your laptop, and whenever you learn something that you think is pertinent, to start just transcribing that down, a quick note with the page number attached to it, the very least, just make highlights in the book, your physical book you're reading. But eventually doing that, you're going to realize better and better ways to systematize those notes that you're taking. And before you know it, you're going to have a bulk of information that is easily going to be shaped into some sort of publication or accessed later for whenever you want to reference it just to know something. And I recommend that you make your time spent reading and learning mean something by keeping tabs on what it is you're learning. So it's not just passive consumption where maybe 1 to 5% of it retains somewhere in your memory banks. You know what I mean? That's something I learned from you, and it's been incredibly helpful to take that approach. Even though it takes discipline and it takes more time, there's nothing more valuable.
Well, a lot of people in this space are already big picture thinkers anyway. And I wouldn't have been able to learn or come to the conclusions that I came to if I didn't take meticulous notes and then have an overall picture to draw from. It's like each piece of information is a dot, and eventually those dots emerge into like a picture, so that when you connect them, it's like, oh, that's exactly what it is. And it's a great way to, like you said, retain information, but it's just a great way to organize things. And if you put them in like a Word document, whenever you need to revisit, even if you never publish the information, you can use the keyword searches and find stuff. And I do that all the time with my work that I've already done, because like we've talked about, one man can't remember all of this stuff. You're gonna, that's why I make as much. I don't know when's this going to get published, but right now there is a sale going on where because Amazon got rid of their matchbook program, I can't make the ebooks free for the people who bought the paperbacks anymore. But what I can do is I enroll them in these little sales that happens once every quarter for like a week. You can get everything for 75% off. And in this one, you can get the first 2 books of the Tale of Honora for free. So that's kind of exciting.
Very cool. Yeah, I've been using a program called Scrivener. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a $60 program, and then you've got a license for it. You can put on any of your computers, and it's just a nice, simple, almost kind of old school looking format where you can easily create like branching note page trees, and it's got sort of an internal system that you could format a book with, and it has guidelines for that, whether ebook or a physical book. So that's been a really helpful place for me to store my notes, because again, I got a quick reference. But there's loads of things like that. There's Evernote, there's Microsoft OneNote. The point is that you're just keeping track of stuff somewhere. Nah, that's gonna
Are your notes starting to look like Charlie from Always Sunny in Philadelphia?
A little. That's Gabe. You're mistaken me for Gabe. My stuff's pretty well organized. Like I just opened my Scrivener, and right here I have a note page that lists all the Hebrew letters, their numerical value, a type font of the Hebrew letter for quick reference, the meanings of the letter, the tarot cards associated to the letter, the way the letter is spelled if you were saying the letter name as a word, the numerical value of the word spelled out or alternate spellings. So I have I have the master cheat sheet of Hebrew language mysticism that I just put together as I figure things out. And that came about from doing the Loki work.
And what's great about that is you've now done that work. So if you wanted to publish that in a book, and if you've double checked it and it's all legit, for someone like me, that's a great resource, right? So it's like, I don't have to ever do that work because you've done it. And that's how this force, if you will, whatever is going on, force is not the right word, but it's just a lingo thing that came to mind. It's a quickening, right? There's something that happens with knowledge and wisdom. And as you acquire, and the more people that can contribute rock solid facts, the more people can see the big picture and then from their experience in life, contribute to stuff that you and I would never have the access to see. And as we've talked about, a lot of the information that we'll get into is not well published. And some of it's in private libraries, private collections, so it's not published at all. So the more people that are, some people are sitting on gold mines and they don't realize it because they've never had the perspective that we're about to give them, the content that we're talking about.
Yeah. All right. So the outline begins with, I wanted to bring up, because of course the book, people that have followed you up to this point or followed our podcast together, you already know we're going to be talking about the ancient Italians and the Etruscans, but I wanted this podcast to just sort of be the comprehensive overview of the big picture rather than maybe the piecemeal parts here and there that have come through, like Vibrance we've done. So we'll start with just talking about how asserting that the real universal empire, these Thessalocrats, were Etruscan and that the Phoenicians are Etruscan is not some sort of Dylan waving the flag of Italy being that he's actually from, like, ancestrally from there. I'm sure that for you, it's probably painful to have to make these claims while also being Italian, because it kind of hurts the credibility of the argument when it's your own people that you're pointing at. But on a bigger picture, the Celts, the Gauls, the Irish, a lot of Nords, there's evidence to it's not just the Italians, but it's a shared sort of ancestry where the epicenter of how all of these people that share a phenotype and a language affinity got to different parts of the world would have been from this, most likely the place where the oldest artifacts are found, and is in the most central location between the East and West, and a big boot peninsula that has seas on all sides. So why don't you go ahead and get into that? The Celtic, Gaulish, Etruscan, Phoenician shared various shared affinities that these cultures have, and maybe why you think that's important.
Well, going back to what we were going to say about Godfrey Higgins, do you remember? He posted something. I forget who it was. I think it was a section from. It was either published in a quarterly research paper or something, but it basically had like over 50 words that are shared with the Roman, the Celtic, the Sanskrit, but also their numerical names of the numbers and stuff. And you see how those are all basically the same. And so everybody's kind of known about this affinity between Sanskrit, the so-called Indo-European languages, and then, the Celtic and ancient Italian languages. But we've always thought that we could trust this historical narrative that the status quo says that, it's all coming from India. And I always wondered about that. I'm like, well, why does nobody look Indian? Like from India, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like, and they weren't allowed, like the priest classes of India weren't allowed. India was much bigger, what you would consider India back then. Like it went to the borders of like Pakistan and Iran yeah. So like they weren't allowed past that border. So how is all of this stuff getting from India to Europe? And furthermore, the Sanskrit was like the only language that still conformed when it was in use to all of its rules, meaning it was something that never was disseminated among the public because it doesn't have like the corruptions and transposition that you see in all these languages of, Britain and Europe and stuff like that. And a lot of this started materializing because in order for me to get to where I was, I had to go through the works of people like Reverend Robert Taylor and stuff, where they expose so much of the forgery that you're no longer trying to make things make sense. It's like, boom, cut the anchor. You don't have an anchor anymore. Now you're going to actually see where the artifacts and stuff takes you. You're not going to be sitting here trying to say, because like right now, when people find something, they interpret their findings based on what they're taught is already established. So if what they're taught is already established and they're trying to make this artifact that they're finding make sense, they're going to come to totally different conclusions. And you see that like we were just talking about this off in text. The crucified Savior already existed in Italy and Greece long before the Christian era. You can find it in artifacts of Ixion. And other people destroyed some of those artifacts thinking they were Christian forgeries. And it's like, no, that stuff already, but those were real artifacts you destroyed. Those weren't forgeries. You just couldn't see that because you saw those artifacts and associated them with Jesus Christ.
Well, and then also conveniently, you have Greek, quote unquote, authors who then give you this mythological story of Ixion to account for those type of artifacts that, is one of those Farrago clear nonsense so-called ancient Greek things, probably originating from sometime in the Middle Ages and then being attributed back to older times. And that's one of the things that I do see a lot of in the truth space is suspicion about ancient Greece, ancient Rome being like, well, something about this doesn't add up. I think it's fake and gay. And your work with this particular book just really not just this one, but going back to Terminalia in particular, with all the Reverend Robert Taylor quotes in the final couple chapters, just destroys the credibility of all of that stuff. Especially though the so-called Greek mythographers who we'll talk about later in this podcast. But when you brought up the Sanskrit, one thing I learned from your stuff is how in the world would Sanskrit be the point of origin for these other languages when it has double the amount of letters? Alphabets do not ever lose letters. They only gain letters as they evolve and improve. So that right out rules out the whole thing. And also you have the oldest inscriptions in India, 250 BC around, and the artifacts in Italy are so much older than that. So there's just a couple of points to contend
related to the system. Related. So I'm not, whoever sees this, I don't want you to be offended in saying that we're not saying that India isn't an old culture, that all these people didn't exist, but related to this system of language, of religious symbolism, of government, all that stuff. And it's not to say they're not being diffused with each other and culturally interacting. They are. But to say something is the origin of something else when everything in the historical record defies that. Like, even if you look up,
right, there's back and forth inspiration and communication, but there was one side that was a seafaring empire and there's one side that wasn't. So yes, they interacted and both sides inspired and changed each other. But yeah, the historical version of the mainstream historical narrative basically inverts what all the evidence seems to point to in terms of the flow of origin.
And if you're hearing this, you're ancient. You're from ancient bloodlines because you're still here. Your bloodline hasn't gone extinct. So it's not to take away from anybody's antiquity, but it is to show you there's little techniques, like it's established fact that the less letters a language has, the older it is. The less vowels it uses, the older it is. And you see that in the Etruscan, it's got that kind of Hebraic system where it leaves out vowels in certain parts of the words, where in Greek, you don't. They're adding the vowels. So to say that that's coming from Greek, it's already betraying previously established techniques for dating things. And the only reason people are able to deceive themselves is because they have their religious beliefs that they need to uphold in order to make this stuff work. And when you see people discover artifacts, you can tell what's forgery right away. Because one of the things that people used to throw at me all the time, like a couple years ago, was the Vinci tablets out of like the Serbian region. And they're like, see, this is it's almost 1-for-1 Etruscan. And it's like, yeah, but it has 22 letters. So you're telling me that Etruscan comes from that, yet you are using an older alphabet that has way more letters than the early 12-letter Etruscan alphabets from Gorius and Swinton and all these other scholars. So, and that's going to be that's been published before, but I'm going to publish it in my, I've already got the chapter in, it's ready to post. So it'll post in a couple of weeks of the audiobook version. Now I'll just try to help people see the visuals that I'm talking about in the book so they can see, oh yeah, I now know what this alphabet is. So if you're trying to invert history, I can catch you on it. And most people can't catch people on it because we're not really taught about alphabets, especially ancient alphabets, when there's no practical use for them, And that's why Europeans are so, I'm saying this with the most loving and respect possible, the most love and respect possible, but we're generally ignorant of our history because the church and all these institutions have done such a number on us that we don't even know where the hell, we think we come from India.
They literally put India, like Indo-European, as the mythical language group when there is no Indo-European language. Let's talk about, though, you just brought up a good point, and it flows really nicely into the second bullet point. The reasons for our general lack of knowledge about ancient Italians. I really appreciated some of those insights. I also forgot to mention in the introduction how one of the things I particularly enjoy about the real Universal Empire is relative to a couple of your last books, the proportion of quoting other authors versus your own words is more skewed very much more heavily towards your own thoughts and words, which I really appreciate that. It's not that the other books with all the quoting was bad or wrong. It was necessary because the whole argument rested on the fact that the admissions of forgery were coming from the very church fathers and all.
And it's not my system. It's not, well, I didn't invent this. So in order to teach people, you got to show you got to show what's out there in the historical record. And that's, it's not even an appeal to authority, but it's just for me, the spirit world is about giving you as much technical ammunition possible so you could do this work on your own. Whereas this is I've done the work. If you've been subscribed to me in my Substack, you've seen everything that I've looked at. And a lot of that technical knowledge I got from other archaeologists, Etruscologists. So it's not coming from me. It's just, this is what's in the historical record. This person said this. I can now look this up, and some of it you can find online, and you see it for yourself. And you're like, yeah, they're right. These urns from the 9th century, these biconical and hut-shaped urns, they're nothing like the Greeks. The tomb paintings, the Greeks didn't have tomb paintings. In fact, what's crazy to me that people aren't talking about is the Etruscans have way more affinity with the Egyptians than they do with the Greeks. Way more. I wouldn't be surprised if you're going to be looking at Italy and Egypt being some sort of symbiotic culture at some point.
Well, if you're right about your assertion that the Phoenicians are Italian or Etruscan in origin, there's already admitted status quo connection between the more eastern colonies of the Phoenicians, like what is called Phoenicia, and the ancient Egyptians. So that's already in the mix. You're connecting the dots in such a way that it actually adds understanding and comprehension to why there's Egyptian pharaohs with Etruscan script on their sarcophagi. Or
not a pharaoh. She was this might be astronomical. So they might be misinterpreting that text because it says something like divine seamstress. Like there's words in that like, are you guys actually trying to interpret an allegorical script and then assign historical value to it? It's hard to say because when you translate some of this stuff, nobody can fully translate it. The only way you can get the gist of what
Etruscan, you mean?
Yeah. The only way you can get the gist of the context is by the common words that are still found in the Latin.
Well, yeah, let's back to my last question. The reasons for lack of knowledge of the ancient Italians. Can you get into some of that?
Well, as far as I can tell, it looks like whatever happened at the turn of the Common Era, whenever that was established, and I don't believe I can't say for sure because I don't know. So I don't want people to think that I'm making this claim. But from what I can tell, I don't think people really know anything about what happened up to the 3rd century BC. I think the Common Era was reckoned in the AD. And if you catch me, I make these mistakes all the time, Chance, because I have got so many thoughts that I'm trying to make sense of that I accidentally say the exact opposite. Like I just said BC, I think, instead of AD. If you catch me, feel free to it's not offensive.
Like when you said BC in my mind, I just auto-corrected it because I was like, yeah, 3rd century AD is about where it seems that all of the bullshit started brewing. And so
you already get what I'm saying. So that's that. And I apologize if I make mistakes, guys. It's really hard doing podcasts. It's not my strong suit, but
especially when you're as meticulously perfectionist as you are.
Yeah. Just like
you're the only person that calls me later or texts me later, like, oh man, I messed this up. And you go into the YouTube comments and
I did it with booty yoga.
This is the thing. And I have had 0 guests who've ever published retractions of things that they got wrong and in error. So like, if that doesn't tell you if there's some integrity here, I don't know what does, but I find that very funny.
I got a shitload wrong. Not like, you know what I'm saying, so nobody corrects me. But like when Booty Yoga commented in our last one, he said, so the Vulgate is older than the Septuagint. And I was like, yeah, the Vulgate is younger than I said younger, but I meant older. And it's like, that literally just undoes the point that I was trying to make because I didn't catch myself. And so I just do that all the time. But where I want to go with this is just for your question. It looks like the Common Era was not established at the Common Era. It's not like they're like, we're redoing everything at 0 AD.
Of course. And why would they? Even if Jesus was real, like even if he was a real historical figure, it would have to come later that they would re-reckon the year and the date.
Yeah, based on him. Exactly. And so that it looks like everything was established and it's crazy how many things line up with this 270 AD marker, because that's roughly when the first Greek writer mentions Moses. So prior to that, not one writer who isn't in the Jewish mystery schools or whatever mentions Moses, the initiates. And it turns out that Moses is actually a name for the initiated in Egypt. And all this stuff goes back to stuff, it's not really related, but part of being initiated into these mysteries, you leave your old life behind and you're born again. You're born anew. That's part of the symbolism laid up in it. So that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. But so whatever happened in that first 3 centuries, I think if they knew about it, because they had to create it in such a way that it would hold up, the test of time. So where would this take place? Judea, because they didn't have historians in Judea. What time setting would this take place? In the Augustan era, when everybody would have known about it. And so all these little things create this mystique that everybody knew this was going on, that this is all like, it's like an illusion, and you're building up the illusion to make it more realistic so that it lasts longer. It's kind of interesting. It actually is fascinating if you don't get emotionally attached to any of it. But
and the people that they're like, in terms of these false historians or the reimagined chronology that the Christian era ushered in, it was really being done to basically dupe the deceivers themselves. It was never expected that the general public would become literate, or that these things would have to be defended in a court of public opinion and make sense to scrutinizing non-believers, right? And that's where Reverend Robert Taylor comes in to play, is that he was one of the first that really took an axe to this whole thing and tried to point out all of the many, many, many flaws. So that's a big part. Yeah, what you're saying is a big part of it. And knowing the keys of astrotheology, you see, well, Moses, Jesus, Perseus, Osiris, they all share some very common traits. Or Krishna. Like, why is it that it's always an evil king who wants to kill them when they're a baby? How come sometimes they're like half of the people I just named are thrown into a river or an ocean in a basket? Or Noah, Noah's basket is the ark. And it goes on. And you realize it's like the same exact system and just given to different people with slightly different trappings, right? But
I've got another one for you, Chance. How many people in this space, people that are our friends, have you heard talk about Osiris being cut into 14 pieces?
I mean, it's cut up frequently.
I've never come across one artifact or like ancient document. There's nothing in the historical record that says he was cut up into 14 pieces.
Well, they say the same of Kronos. Kronos was cut up and thrown into Tartarus, but
or Bacchus is rent into pieces.
Well, you bring up a good point, though. That's true too. You bring up a really good point. How a lot of what we spread around is like the Egyptian mythos and culture is probably created way later in the exact same style of invention that what we consider to be the ancient Greek system of mythology was probably written by, Middle Age or Dark Ages monks and shit. Like way later after the fact. And then these forged documents that are only ever under the possession of the church anyway are used and pointed to as like, well, this is what we have passed down, the tradition of the ancient Greeks. The same is done with the Egyptians, I think. And it's particularly important that we can point that out with the Egyptians, what you just said, like there's, as far as we know, nothing that's a physical datable artifact that gives us any indication of the antiquity of this particular mythos that we call Egyptian, because that could be very well a big link in the chain of the fence that's walling us off from understanding the true universal empire, of which the Etruscans and the Egyptians seem to have been a common culture to each other, or very connected in some way. And this is definitely answering the question pretty well about the reasons for lack of knowledge about the ancient Italians. You make a couple good quotes, but the one I'll start with though is the lack of knowledge about the ancient Italians and their alienness to the rest of the world are marks of their antiquity rather than their youth. That's something that I pondered, and I was like, yeah, that's a good point. Can you talk about that, the alienness of the Etruscan culture?
And I want to give all credit. Like, I got this from these Etruscologists, and there's a lot of people, and I thank God for them, because a lot of them aren't even Italian. They have no skin in this game whatsoever. And they're saying, like, dude, this one woman, her name is Jocelyn Penny Small. She literally was like, if you take off your Greek sunglasses, simply put, the Etruscans are not Greeks. And it's so frustrating being an Italian, how everybody, because we created an empire, when you establish those trade routes, they go both ways, and people gravitate to the centers of prosperity, which is Italy. And the one thing that Italy didn't have is gold or silver. So what they did have was every other kind of metal, from like iron, cinnabar, like, not that cinnabar is a metal, but they had everything.
Except tin, but
Copper.
they had access to the tin.
They had a little bit of tin, but yeah, you had to go, I think, into Spain and then Britain to get the tin, to get like in big enough to lead to a Bronze Age, if you will.
Yeah.
And so they were always selling their wares and stuff for gold because they didn't have it naturally. And but back to what I was talking about, it's frustrating being from these areas because our culture has been basically destroyed, our original cultures. And it's like, once you're cut off from who you are and where you're from, you're like a boat without an anchor, and you're just at the mercy of the tides. And it's tough figuring out where you're going, or what kind of purpose you should have in your life. And I think
it opens you up to be credulous when the man in the dress tells you the history according to his order and sect, as then, the next centuries after this 300 or so AD time period, the Italians just were like, okay, we'll take it. They didn't have anything else to go with.
And that's one of the reasons we've survived, is we're very good. Like, someone can come invade our country and be like, yeah, come on. Just don't put your feet on the couch. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, we've historically gotten along really well. Like, even these early empires, they weren't really imperialistic. Like, they would get in skirmishes once in a while, but they were more about just making connections and like increasing their own resources so they could facilitate their own artistic endeavors, their own culture and civilization endeavors. It wasn't really this like hierarchical military system. That's what it became after people.
And life wasn't cheap like it is in the meat grinders of World War I and II, when populations have swollen to huge sizes. Back then, it was like every man was a potential huge resource. It's not like you wanted to just throw all that away. Yeah.
You see that even in America, right? Like, even like when you go from a city, you get frustrated with all the interaction and stimulus from all these people. But then once you go to somewhere rural, when you see someone, it's like, hey, another person. Like, you're like sociable all of a sudden. And that's exactly like, even at the height of the Roman Empire, only 3 million people lived in the limits of Rome. And so it wasn't imperialistic until other people started coming into Italy and trying to invade it, because it's like, well, they're really productive. We can go take what they have, pillage them, and after a couple of times of getting humiliated, that's what made everybody in Italy say, fuck this. And all of a sudden you go from a civilization that had almost no social hierarchy other than like elders and like, religious figures and stuff, to now such rigid standards, like if you retreat, you die. If you, like it, they took a whole new level. And that's kind of what you see with like Cosa Nostra, right? And like these quote unquote, these systems that like people now call like organized crime or whatever. But the reason they work is because it was a framework of rules. Just like the early America, the reason it was so successful was a frame of rules. And everybody was bound. That's what it means. The rule of law, the republic, the public thing. So when you have that system of rules that everybody's bound by, it doesn't matter who you are. If you break them, you're going to be held to the consequences of breaking that. And once you get rid of that, or you make an excuse, well, this person gets to get away with breaking those rules because he's this person's son. Then as soon as that happens, you lose all credibility. And you're not long for this world, because somebody else is going to be like, we got to get rid of this person because they're breaking the rules. And so once Italy got humiliated, then it started getting imperialistic to say, you know what? the best defense is a good offense, and we're just taking it all. And that's what we did. Not me. I mean, I wasn't there, but I have family that participated, you know?
De Cesare. Well, another thing from the book to quote, that the Etruscan art, other than the Etruscan architecture being un-Greek, also their way of life, their medicine and music, their personal appearance, the role of women being much freer, and the lack of social hierarchy differentiating them from the Greeks and Romans. Most notably, the absence of disparity between nobles and serfs demonstrates they were older and unlike the despots from the East. So I'm wondering how we know that they had this kind of different social convention and looser hierarchy or less spreading out a difference between nobles and serfs. Do you think that this feudal system that we can definitely associate with later Italy once the Roman Catholic Church rises is from like the wealth and prosperity creating this difference? Or
yeah, and I think the feudal system, that's it. I think Godfrey Hagrins is 100% correct in that the feudal system is, I forget who he cited, but someone wrote, it's in one of my books. It was such a great quote, but it's basically like the feudal system is like an exotic plant to Europe. If somebody brought it there. Because before that, even certain historians, whether this is astrotheology or not, because it's talking about Janus, but the account is that there were no kings in Italy during the time of Janus. So you see that this hierarchy system, it really is part of the church, because and well, I don't want to say church, maybe the priest class leading up to the church, like, because this is all in Rome too, right? Like a lot of these fiefdoms and like kingdoms and lands in Gaul and like France and all that stuff, they were basically given to people because they were no longer being used as productive land by the Roman Empire after they like left those areas. So where they get some of these ideas is when they open the tombs and they look at the tomb paintings and they look at the artifacts and stuff, and you see there's not as much discrepancy. And there are some accounts from Roman writers and Greek writers that one of the reasons Rome was able to eventually overpower the Etruscan Empire is because Rome had a strict hierarchy that made it very good for military endeavors, and the Etruscans did not have that hierarchy. So when it came to battle, they weren't as formidable in organizing and all that stuff, and that's why they lost. And you see that like when they get absorbed by Veii. Now that could be a total bunch of BS, you know? So you have to take some of this with a grain of salt. It's just people's interpretation of what they're finding in the archaeological record. And that's why it's important to just keep, I don't want to say keep an open mind, stay flexible. Don't cling to anything that you can't demonstrate, because certain things might come to light that totally changed what you thought. And it's okay to reverse your position as long as you've set yourself up in a place where you can walk it back and say, oh yeah, this is wrong because I thought this because I saw this, but it turned out it's not the case. And that's why I leave the leeway for myself to be wrong and about a lot about it, like my interpretation or about my conclusions. But what's not wrong is the established facts.
Well, one thing that differentiates you, and other than what you just said, which I notice all the time in your work, that you leave the back door open if you need to leave the structure that you're starting to build out of your conjectures. But one of the main issues with our lack of knowledge of ancient Italians and our lack of knowledge of European history in deep antiquity in general is the fact that archaeologists and scholars, as you say, couldn't allow their findings to create the narrative, but rather they used those old accounts to explain their findings. And those old accounts you're talking about are the Greek and Roman histories that are likely introduced to Europe in the Middle Ages, rather than being an actual transmission or succession of accounts. So archaeologists trying to explain the actual artifacts they're finding based on what Thucydides or Herodotus said, rather than based on what you...
And neither one of those dudes, neither of those guys you just mentioned.
The father of history, Herodotus, the father of scientific history, Thucydides.
They don't mention Rome. Not one of them mentions Rome. What? Are you kidding me?
It would have been the biggest deal. Herodotus doesn't mention Moses either. You'd think a guy parting a damn sea would make it into the book. Thank you for listening to Inner World. To unlock the second half of this episode and access the entire archive of our research, join Interverse Plus or become a supporter on Dylan's Substack. Find links to all the different ways you can support at interverseplus.com.
So not only am I part of the Caesar family, I'm also part of the Conti family, and I'm also from a family whose last name is Troy. The Bible is literally a book of forgeries and bearing false witness. It's absolutely crazy when you see this. There's like 15 different cities underneath Florence, and none of the Italians know what any of them are. They know what like 2 or 3 of them are.
The entrances are guarded. You can't get in.
I speak Sicilian Phoenician, Punic. Time breaks down everything. Time is the wolf who eats everything.